I'm a bit jealous of Ryan. He looks a lot more comfier than I do.
Yeah, I'm on a nice chair. It's not. I've had to come out the way of the kids, or this will be filled with kids asking me stupid questions. So.
Hello everyone and welcome back to SGTV. Today we are joined by Ryan Dempsey from E5. Say hello, Ryan.
Hello, you okay?
Yeah, good, thanks. It's good to have you on the show. We've been after you guys from E5 for a while, and we've also got Paul Chaffers and Richard Townsend from NAPIT joining us today.
How you doing?
How are you both?
I'm good, thanks.
It's good to have you. It's good to have you both. Am I saying this right? Is it NAPIT or is it NAPIT? Which one is it? I'll get told off.
NAPIT apparently. It's NAPIT, but I think outside the business you can say what you like. Inside, it's frowned upon to say NAPIT. So
I did have a suggestion at the last elects that they should all have T-shirts with a picture of a horse on the back and someone digging a hole, and just for pronunciation, just to help people understand how it's meant to be pronounced.
That's not a bad idea. I think, especially with my dodgy Midlands accent, you know, saying it right, I don't want to get slapped on the wrist. So today we're going to be talking about EICR. So we'd hope that any electricians, if not all electricians out there, should be aware of what it is essentially. But for you guys at NAPIT, could you give us a brief explanation of what EICR essentially is?
An EICR used to be called a periodic inspection report, but that could mean anything. Like we go and look at a shed, or go and look at your lawn, you know, and do a periodic inspection report of it. So a few years ago, it was decided to change the name of it to an electrical installation condition report, because it was deemed that the end user would understand actually what they were getting. They were going to get a condition report based on the state or condition of their electrical installation, so EICR. And that's essentially what it is. It's a statement of a certain amount of checks, limitations if depending on certain aspects that are accessible to an inspector, with an overall understanding of what that electrical installation is good for, whether it's safe for continued use, whether it's satisfactory, unsatisfactory, whether it meets the exact parameters of the latest standard of 7671, because we always carry out an inspection to the latest standard. That doesn't mean that previous installations are any less safe. Just state that in any version of 7671. You know, you can have older versions, doesn't mean they're any less safe. But an EICR, its basic role is to ensure that an electrical installation is safe for continued use. That's it. That's all it's for, really.
I mean, you sort of answered my next question, is why has it been introduced? I know you've mentioned safety, but you'd think that electricians on site would be ensuring that anyway. So what has prompted it to actually be introduced?
Yeah, I think if we could just clear one thing up, Ben. EICRs are not new. They've not been just introduced. As Richard said, they were previously periodic inspection reports. The name changed to electrical installation condition reports. What is new is the new regulations that have come in surrounding the private rented sector. And I think Ryan would be a good person to bring in at this point, because, you know, that he's been very aware of how this has developed over the years.
Yeah, so I guess, thanks, Paul. I think when we talk about why is this being introduced, so when we talk about EICRs, the guys are completely right. We've had them since time began. There's always been a need, I think since 1882 when the first edition came out, there's always been a need to check electrical installations to make sure that they've been installed correctly and that they're safe. We've changed the name of them. We used to, when I first qualified as a Sparky, it was periodic electrical inspection, and then we moved that over to EICR in 17th edition at some point.
I think it came out Amendment 1.
Right, okay.
1, I think it was.
And I think the reason, in terms of the change, any Sparky or anybody who's kind of coming into the trade, the periodic inspection was an easy document to put together. The hardest thing was that it was a tick sheet, and if the guys remember, you had one page where it was actually half a page where it ticked about yourself and you double insulated. And then all of a sudden in Amendment 1 in the 17th edition, what you had was this introduction of pages 4, 5 and 6, which were just, everybody had a bit of a moan about it because it's new and it's something different. But in terms of what we're talking about here, and as Paul rightly kind of redirected us on the legislation for private rent and why have we created or introduced this new it's called a statutory instrument. So it's not legislation, it's secondary legislation. So it's not enforced by the HSE or anybody. It's actually enforced by the local authority if they choose to enforce it. So I was invited, when I worked for Leeds City Council, I was invited down to London when this first started being discussed back in 2016. And in October 2016, I was sat talking with the committee. Was there? We had the local area building control, we had the fire service, electrical safety first, NAPIT were in there. Everyone was in this committee, all talking about the risk of electrical fires in rented accommodation, in private rented accommodation. And interestingly, when I first attended, they were talking about white goods and how there was an increase in fires on white goods, and there was no legislation around a register for white goods or enforcing kind of a regime of having these things tested and inspected. And I found it really strange that we were talking about that, but then they were started talking about something called an electrical safety check. And I believe even in that committee, they started to confuse themselves by an electrical safety check, and one part of that committee wanted this implemented against electrical distribution, which is your wires, your sockets and everything that's in the walls, and then another side of that committee wanted it to be with white goods, like the fire service, because when you look at electrical safety first, or even if you go to the government website to review the fire statistics in this country, one of the highest reasons for fire in domestic dwellings is electrical appliances. The next one down, I think, is misuse of electrical appliances. And electrical distribution's not really up there with the significant causes of fires. So they started talking about how could we address that. And then all of a sudden, I never went back to any more meetings, and it kind of amalgamated into this new, we need a full EICR. And fundamentally, anyone in the industry who's conversant with the regulations and an EICR and your guidance notes will know that an EICR doesn't check your electrical appliances. And so we've gone from wanting to fix a solution, and I think they've went down the wrong path, to be honest with you. But it is here now. It is here, and I've spoken with some people, and it will improve some things, but it's been introduced because of the increase in fires and electric shocks in dwellings that were being reported, and they felt that this was the right thing to do, to bring something in. It's a long answer, I guess.
No, it's a good answer. My next question, really, and again, these might seem basic to start, but I'm hoping as we progress through this conversation, we can go a bit more in depth. But who is it essentially aimed at? Who's responsible for the EICR? Sorry.
From a PRS perspective, or from any perspective, really, it's the client or owner or person responsible or as having the duty of care of an installation. Because we're talking about private rented sector, that will be a landlord. So it's not the letting agent or anything like that, because the letting agent is exactly that. It's an agent operating on behalf of the client who is a landlord. So any liability sits with the landlord for anything. So it's they that have to initiate and be responsible for having an electrical installation condition report carried out. And it's down to them to choose a contractor and initiate any timescales and have the inspection itself actually carried out. So
yeah. I think it's really important to note as well that we bring in a legislation that puts an onus on landlords. As Richard said, it's the landlord who's responsible for that installation. But you need to be very, very, very aware that prior to this legislation coming into place, in the rented sector, as a person who owns an electrical installation, the first port of call for anybody who's got electrical qualifications or knowledge of electrical safety will say regulation number 4 in the electricity at regs, the electricity at work regulations, which has been around since 1989, That clearly states that all electrical systems should be managed and maintained in a safe condition throughout its useful life and so on. That phrase is then mirrored right across the likes of Consumer Protection, Plugs and Sockets, Landlord and Tenants Act, Housing Act, HHSRS, which is your Decent Home Standard. Is that statement, so the responsibility to ensure systems are electrically safe has always been there. This is just and I think this probably confuses the matter, because we've created legislation to make it assume or seem like there was nothing before it, but there is something there. There always has been something there to enforce it.
It's a really good point, that, Ryan. Really good point. Unfortunately, there's many great landlords out there that would take that due diligence and have the safety checks, but there were installations, and we've seen some as NAPIT inspections. We were contracted to go and look at different projects. I was involved in one called the London Lockdown Project, and we saw some very, very unsafe installations. And rightly or wrongly, how this has come about, it is forcing more letting agents and more businesses to ask for condition reports. And on those condition reports, unsafe conditions are being picked up. So whether or not it addresses the white goods thing, which probably doesn't, as you know, you've pointed out, is one thing, but the fact is we're now at a stage where a lot more contractors are being asked to do these condition reports. So in terms of electrical safety, more inspections are being carried out, which can only really be seen as a good thing.
I think you're right. Anything that improves. I've always said since I came into this industry that if something that we change or implement has the possibility of saving just one person's life, then it is fully and totally 100% worthy of everybody's attention to drive that agenda. One of the biggest problems you have with this, and when we see who this is aimed at, you've got loads of different types of landlords. You've got the landlords who've fallen into the trap of becoming a landlord. You've got people who use it as a business, who buy properties, but you have got really bad landlords. And my concern is this committee, who's developed this standard, hasn't considered those really bad landlords who Paul's just mentioned. One of them, you really bad standards in London. That landlord has a hold on that tenant, and that tenant relies on that person to provide them a castle to live in. That's their home. Now, if that person then goes to this standard and says, "Dear landlord, are you aware there's a new standard now that I can refer you to the local authority and you'll be fined £30,000, that landlord's first thing going to come out of his mouth is, pack your stuff, get out and find somewhere else to live. Now, we're not really catering. We seem to be catering more for this dream of electrical safety, when in actual fact, we've probably created more problems with people's lives by creating something like this.
What do you think could be done about that, Ryan?
I think the committees and the people who talk about this need to stop having knee-jerk reactions and maybe consider the wider community. Instead of just looking at electrical safety, who does that impact and what are the other things? No one, as part of this whole process, will have considered what I've just said there. And that's because they will have, right from the beginning, had an intent. And that intent has been followed like a railway line all the way to its end goal. And it's blatantly obvious that that's the case. So I just think in future, maybe consider all of the options and all of the impacts on people's lives before you make a decision to create a new standard or legislation. The cost of an EICR isn't going to dent your pocket. And if you're a landlord and you charge £1,000 a month for your rent, if you're one of those landlords who looks at that £1,000 because you bought the property outright and that £1,000 is profit in your pocket, then you're a bad landlord, quite plain and simple. But if you look at that £1,000 as, okay, £1,000 over 12 months, that's a £12,000 rent. What statutory obligations do I need to achieve as part of that 12,000, and then start cutting that down? So every 5 years, you're going to spend 150 quid on a periodic inspection. Obviously, that ranges throughout the country. And you times that by, you divide that by 5 to give you your annual cost of a periodic inspection. And it is nothing, it's pennies.
Yeah. Am I right in thinking that this only applies to landlords, to rented accommodation? So it wouldn't apply to just yourself if you own your own home? Would you not have to get this tested?
No, this is only for private rented properties. So no, this isn't if you own your own property.
Yeah, and it is interesting you should ask that, because this was driven just for private rented, and I'm the chairman of a social housing committee, and we've recently been approached by Electrical Safety First to try and bring this into social housing as well. So I think that's the wrong move. It's a really bad next step for the industry. I agree. Let's try and fix private rent, and let's review this in a couple of years and see what impact it's had. See if we can redefine it maybe and make it better. But they are trying to push this into other areas that are unnecessary. But at the moment, it is just for private landlords. But if you read the regulations, the requirements they mirror the requirements for what's called a HMO, which is a house of multiple occupation, where it's like an old Victorian house that's been converted into 4 apartments, but they all share the kitchen, or they share the bathroom and stuff. That would be classed as a HMO, and the requirements for them, they need to be tested every 5 years, and that test sheet or that report needs to be submitted to the local authority. So it's very similar to the HMO standards.
They've altered it. There is a caveat on the 2020 legislation, and it refers to an HMO. And basically, I think I can't remember the exact wordings. I'll dig it out while you're talking about other stuff. But it says paragraph whatever of HMO is now superseded by this. So the requirements for this now replace what the requirements for the HMO were.
I think that I think if you do dig that out, I think that'll be to do with experience, because that's the only thing I agree with this new legislation, is the fact that you have to demonstrate experience. That's new. That's a fantastic way of determining who's right and who's wrong to do these tests. So it'd be interesting to see if it is the experience of the engineer who does it.
Another thing I've
talk
noticed
amongst yourselves. I'll find it. I'll find it.
Another thing I've noticed is there can be some confusion about what regs apply and where the EICR applies in the UK, because am I right in thinking it varies between England, Wales and Scotland and even Northern Ireland?
Yes, this legislation is just for England only. They have different arrangements in the different places, but this new legislation for the private rented sector is for England only.
They have followed Scotland. Yeah, Scotland did introduce it first, maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago, which is, and one of the questions I've asked a number of times is, why aren't we looking to get some statistics and publish them? Because if they implemented it 2 years ago, all of the right statistics to justify what we've done in England should be there already. We should be able to see those statistics that say this was the right thing to do.
How much influence do you guys have? You know, the likes of E5 or NAPIT, how much influence do you have on actually sort of trying to enforce, well, not enforce these, but to bring about change to these regs and rules?
I mean, we're all involved in the different committees and the working groups with these things. I can't speak for E5, but from NAPIT, they've always been, the NAPIT Trade Association has always been very passionate about electrical safety. So any moves towards having extra inspections done, extra reports, extra safety checks done, we've always been right behind that. So without getting into the politics of whether we've ended up with the correct set of regulations, as a body, we have always, sort of supported that it's the right thing to do to check installations frequently, because the problem is you can have an installation, it can be absolutely healthy, and the tenant can smash something, break something, move out, or they might make an alteration, put a little hot tub in the garden or something. They move out, somebody moves in, and there's an accident. So really 5 yearly is quite a long time still, but to at least have it done 5 yearly, you're going to capture those dangerous situations a lot more frequently than if you're not doing those checks. Some installations, as Ryan's already said, a lot of landlords, they are good and they follow a process, but not all. We've all seen unsafe installations. So from NAPIT's point of view, anything that enhances electrical safety is a good thing.
Yeah, it's interesting as well what Ryan said about how you're almost in the hands of a landlord, a bad landlord. and it'd be interesting to see if there was any portal or something online where someone could report that they've maybe said, "Oh, I'd like you to get the electrics checked as you're supposed to," and then they've been kicked out. Maybe there's nowhere for them to actually vent that grievance.
There is websites. There are things that you can go on anonymously, but unfortunately, I think Shelter might be a good place to go. Shelter does have something along that lines. You'd have to kind of check into that. But again, it's only anonymous until the landlord finds out.
Yeah,
and that's your problem.
Just to throw something else in there, where it says it's a maximum, the legislation states throughout the tenancy that the landlord is responsible for the safety of the tenant and the electrical installation. So that doesn't mean to say, "Oh, goody, I don't have to do anything for 5 years." You should be actively seeking to assess the installation and to ensure that it complies throughout. So it's like having your car MOT'd and then getting stopped 2 years later and saying, "Oh, your tyres are bald, mate." Oh, well, the blame to the MOT testing station that tested your car 2 years ago. It's their fault for not seeing it. Well, they didn't know what you were going to do with it. So it's the same. It's exactly the same with any EICR. If you get it done today and in 4 years' time something else happens and you've made no attempt to do something about it, then you are still at fault. Going back to the HMO, what the 2020 legislation for PRS said is basically it removes 6.3 of the HMO regulation, and 6.3 is basically the part that's talking about the electrical installation. And 6.3 of the HMO says the manager must ensure every fixed installation, blah, 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 is testing inspected, not exceeding 5 years, obtain a certificate and supply a certificate, etc., within 7 days to the person asking for it or the authority. That's been removed from the HMO, and instead, HMOs now need to comply with the PRS part. So they've taken it out. They just haven't told you they've taken it out very well, but then they don't do a lot very well. So that's what we can do with them, I'm afraid. So yeah, it's 6.3 of houses or management of houses, multiple occupation in England, 2006. 6.3 has been removed by the 2020 regulation. Anyway.
Just to go back to one of the questions you just asked, and Paul answered it from a NAPIT perspective, but I didn't get a chance to answer it from an E5 in terms of the influence we have in the industry. One of the, it's a crying shame really. With E5, there's the main 5 founding members. There's obviously myself, there's Dan, there's Paul, the 2 Pauls, and there's David Watts, Sparky Ninja, who were all part of this founding group. And we do at least once a week, we'll all jump on a call like this and we'll review something like solar PV or EV charging, and we'll look deeper into where it came from and what the technology is. And we then release that into similar to this one. We release that out into the market. At the moment, we're looking at TNS systems, which we understand is the topic of the month, and we've brought that to the attention to a lot of people. And we do a lot of research around that, and we look at European standards, international standards, and we try and understand why the regulations, and these guys sit on the committee that writes the wiring regulations, and unfortunately they're never going to let E5 into that committee. And it's a bit of a crying shame, because we have the hearts and minds of a hell of a lot of Sparkies, practicing Sparkies, who all want to have their opinions professionally, and we represent them, I guess. And that's so we don't have any direct influence, but I'm very, very aware that there are a lot of people watch what we do and how we do it. So
just to add to that, Ryan, obviously when myself and Richard are sitting on those national committees, they're representing our members. So we do have quite a strong membership base, possibly about approximately 13,000 members. When we're there sort of shaping and working towards the way the regulations are building and growing, we're representing our members. So we're trying to create regulations in the best interest of electrical safety, but also what is sensible for our membership. So, it's great stuff what the E5 guys they're doing, but there are other people at those meetings, supporting the wider industry.
Yeah, I suppose you've just got to make as much noise as you can and hope some of it gets pulled into the right places, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Well,
Well,
when it
the way
comes
it works
to
is everybody has their say, and it is although say for meetings, everyone brings their thing, and by definition, not everyone's going to get their way all the time. So you might, I guess, you think of it as a kind of a battle or a war. You might win a few battles, you might win a few skirmishes, you might lose a few, you might have to swallow your pride, you might have to just shut up every now and then in order to get some of your other stuff through that you want. So it is a juggling game, but it's just that there's a lot of people juggling, and it's just the way it is with all committees, I guess.
Yeah. I just want to come back as well on a point. Is we talked about England, how we've almost followed Scotland. So where does Wales and Northern Ireland stand on EICR? What's their the regs for them at the moment?
My understanding is that Wales followed Scotland and we followed Wales. The meeting that I attended in 2016, somebody dialed in from the Welsh government and they were talking about introducing that. I'd have to check to see whether or not that has been introduced. I suspect it has, and I'm not sure about Northern Ireland.
Another question I had written down was about who needs to be present for the testing. So would it be the landlord or the tenants?
No one.
No one needs to be present. However, from a landlord's perspective, you'd need to be very careful because you are responsible for the safety of that person. So you don't, not so much in the private rented sector as you probably find in the social rented sector, but some people may have needs and requirements to, they might not be too okay with having a stranger in their property. They may, so you as the client, you've got to manage that. You've got to be aware of some people. Could be,
Hey, Richard, listen, I know what you're seeing.
Bothered.
Listen, I know what you're seeing here, and let me see it because you're not allowed to see it. I worked in an environment where we used to have tenants would leave the property, and I remember one perfect example. A tenant would leave the property and leave the electrician in the property to do the test. At the end of it, I had the longest complaint letter you have ever had in your life, telling me that the electrician had unscrewed all the sockets, and it broke the wallpaper because the wallpaper was up against the sockets. I then had a compensation claim for 2 bottles of Veuve Clicquot champagne that they said the electrician stole out the fridge while he was doing the test. Yes, unfortunately, it would help if there's somebody there for those instances, but not every tenant is like that.
So you didn't drink the champagne?
No, I didn't take it, and I'm sure the electrician didn't either.
It was very nice.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the electrician, and I'm pretty sure they were phantom bottles of champagne that never existed in that tenant's fridge.
Yeah, but from a client's perspective, the landlord, they've got to look at that, but they've also got to look at the fact that some tenants may have a medical requirement that might worry them significantly, having a stranger in the house. So as a client, you've got to manage that. I guess the systems in social housing are far more geared up for that. And to be fair, most landlords are doing it anyway. Also, electricians just need to be aware that those kinds of incidents, like Ryan's just said, the things I've just said, could come out. So you've got to be very careful as an electrician, I think, and make sure that's cleared up before you go in with your prospective client. Okay, I'm going to be in there on my own because I'm a one-man band, whatever. Can you ensure that the tenant is aware and is comfortable with that?
The other aspect to this is all testing and inspection. There is a certain element of danger towards you're removing covers, you're going to be doing some live testing. So you need to make the client aware and try and remove any dangers. I mean, we won't get into COVID-19, but that's a situation now where inspectors will have to manage sanitising and social distancing, etc. But just under ordinary circumstances, you don't want to be removing covers off of things with kids running around you. So it's always a case that the electrical inspector has to have an agreement with the client and work out the best process for the the steps to be taken in order to complete the test and inspection.
You've made a good point actually about if you're going in there on your own and silly accusations are made, like Ryan mentioned. So what sort of insurances could you make as an electrician if that is a genuine concern of yours that might put you off from doing this type of work?
Well, you should really have public liability insurance anyway, and professional indemnity. As far as anything else goes, I must stress the things that me and Ryan pointed out are isolated generally.
Yeah, absolutely. Few and far between.
I don't think that you're going to walk into doing the EICR and get back and be looking at, Christ, I've had 4 bottles of champagne. I must be off my face by now. And, you know, it doesn't work like that. So, you know, it's just something to be aware of. It's not going to be a daily thing. Or stress on the inspector would be immense anyway.
Yeah. Do inspectors need to be part of a competent person scheme to do the testing?
They don't have to be part of a competent person scheme. The issue is there's great advantages of being part of a competent person scheme. So members of a scheme are checked for a number of things. They're checked for qualifications and experience to be able to do the work. They're audited to ensure they've got the correct insurances in place. They're issuing the correct paperwork, invoices, contracts, estimates, etc. So there's a lot of checks that's done on a yearly basis. So a landlord choosing to use someone off of one of the schemes, they can rest assured that there's a third-party audit checking these aspects. And of course, the other thing is some remedial work is subject to notification under the building control. So Part P, electrical safety, there's different ways of notification, but members that are part of a scheme can self-certify themselves. So if a landlord asks somebody to do a report and the outcome suggests a consumer unit replacement, if the landlord says, please go ahead and do the replacement, straight away the competent person can do that and issue the correct installation certificate and carry out the notification. So the merits of using somebody off of a scheme are great, but just to be clear, the requirements don't ask for you to be a member of a competent person scheme. They ask for you to be competent. I don't know if Richard or Ryan's got anything to add to that.
It doesn't say. It doesn't even say. It says that you should be qualified. In our understanding of qualifications or being qualified is a mixture of adequate qualifications and experience, which could be construed as competence.
So I'll add a spanner in the work. We won't go into too much detail on it, but it's just food for thought for anybody watching or listening to this. I am not a member of any competent person scheme. I have all my electrical qualifications, my testing and inspecting, the original 2391. I have all of them. I can competently test an installation, and I have done very recently. I also changed the consumer unit very recently. The process behind that doesn't work. I'm happy to share it with anybody who wants to contact me, and I'll take them and show them the consumer unit. But yeah, just to put a little bit of fuel behind that, you don't need to be a member of a competent person scheme. And if you know somebody who is competent to do it and you're confident, I will reiterate what Paul said though, in terms of if you're a landlord, as an industry or as a country, we are like sheep. We will follow what other people say and do. And an example of that is if you're confident with somebody, a family member or a friend who is competent and qualified to carry out that work, and you're happy to take on the risk of if they ever get it wrong, you're going to have to justify that in court. If you go with a competent person scheme, there's more security around your risk as an individual, as a landlord, than there is using someone like me to do it. But I'm going to do it a lot cheaper because it's mates rates, because I don't do it as a business. It's only if I get asked as a friend. However, I know it's really difficult. It's difficult to kind of understand what I've just said there is you don't need to be, but it does have its benefits if you use them. If something goes wrong, only if something goes wrong.
Do you think for an electrician who wants to add doing this testing to his services, that it could be beneficial to be part of the scheme, so that people searching on these competent person scheme websites might bring a bit more traffic towards you?
Absolutely, I think that's a given that if you go onto your competent person's website and type in somebody's name, the guys will probably correct me. I'm not sure you can put in a postcode and get a list of people. I don't think you're allowed to do that.
There is the registered. I'll probably say it the wrong way around, but it's something like the registered electrical competent persons site that you can go on, and all of the schemes put the members that fall into the category of being competent. They're listed on there, and they should say whether it's an inspector or just an installer. And from a competent person's point of view, we only put people onto the registers they've been deemed to be, assessed to. So if we've got this is the problem. You can have engineers say, "Oh, I'm competent. I'm a rocket scientist. I work in, for Rolls-Royce, and I'm the best electrician in the world," but he might not be familiar with domestic electrical installations. And likewise, if you've got a domestic Sparky and he does an EICR in a data center, he's going to come unstuck. So we tend to only put people in the brackets of what they've been assessed for. So the site I told you about is a generic one where you can put a postcode in.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, you can, and it'll list and it'll show you all the NAPIT members and some of the ones from the other schemes. But if you go to the NAPIT site, you'll be able to search just for the NAPIT members, and you'll be able to pick which category, whether it's domestic, whether it's an EICR, whether it's installation. So it's broken right down.
I think what's really interesting with the again, we don't want to kind of fly off piste with this, but one of the interesting things with the competent person schemes with regards to the private renting sector, is all the competent person schemes are a member of what's called the Electoral Technical Assessment Specification Committee. And this is a committee that is governed to write the specification that they have to work to. It's a bit of a double negative. Sounds really weird that they write their own specifications, but they do. And in that standard, you have a number of criteria to meet to be a member at a specific level. So you have Table 4A, which is for domestic dwellings only. So you'll be assessed to work in domestic dwellings only. And we know that as the domestic installer, we see them flying about. And then you've got Table 4B, which refers to all electrical systems. Now, to be an electrician, to call yourself an electrician, there are a series of exams and qualifications you need to get. And that's your level 1, your level 2, or your level 2, your level 3. That's your periodic electrical inspections, because you will have to test your own equipment. You will get yourself to the current edition of the wiring regulations. Now, to meet Table 4B in the specification written by the competent person schemes, you have to have your electrical qualifications, test and inspection, current edition of the wiring regulations. Now they've introduced a new Table 4C for testing and inspecting in private rented, which is exactly the same as 4B. And I've asked the people in the committee to explain that. And I don't fully understand why we've now created a new table for something that the electricians are already competent and qualified for if they're assessed to 4B. It's just got a different title and a different head. It's probably a bit too technical for this debate that we're talking about with the regulations, but it is something for anybody who's interested in the process of defining how things are done in the electrical industry. It's one of the confusing things that probably needs to be clarified, I think.
You've rightly said, Ryan, it's far too deep for this call, but the problem with qualifications is there's so many different qualifications and so many different awarding bodies for those qualifications, and they try and put these tables together to try and map across what is suitable, but when I used to work for NAPIT inspections, they were incredibly difficult. You turn up to see somebody and checking has he got all the right bits and pieces in place. And we're used to the 2391 and the level 3s and what have you, but there's many, many different qualifications out there, different bodies, degrees, all of those things. But just holding a degree or holding a certificate doesn't make you competent, and that's where the yearly assessment and the checks on experience come into it. So that's the sort of thing that we're passionate about at NAPIT, is to ensure that the person who ends up at the doorstep to do the report has been checked.
So going back to the actual testing, again, this might be an obvious question, but what happens if there's a fault, if there's a failure?
From an EICR perspective, we call them observations. So the inspector observes something, and that observation is set against a particular clause or regulation in 7671, and depending on the severity of that observation, it can either be C1, what we call a C1, C2, C3, or an FI. And we'll talk about those in a minute. But if you find a fault and it makes the overall EICR unsatisfactory, the client has 28 days from when the inspection is carried out to rectify that. And he also has to make sure that, well, he has to let the tenant. So there's quite a lot that the client's got to do. But from an inspector's perspective, he carries out an EICR. He notes down observations where the installation that he's inspecting doesn't meet 7671, and in this case it's 2018, 18th edition. And it might be that it's a C1 or a C2 or a C3 or an FI. And he might have several. It's not an overarching thing as in, the entire installation is a C1 or a C2. Lots of different observations set against different criteria and limitations for different observations you find. And then you'll either give them a different classification. So C1 is danger present. So that generally means that there's a live part or something's about to catch fire or has been on fire or could possibly catch fire while you're stood looking at it. But generally, if it's a C1, it's because you can come and touch something that's live there and then and get a shock. C1, immediately dangerous. So for those kinds of instances, the way that we interpreted the new legislation, it gives the inspector the caveat to reduce that 28-day period. So if rather than say, let's say, right, that's a C1, well, 7671 requires that we go and see the client anyway and say, oh, I found the C1. And let's have had that conversation with them before and say, look, I'll find some C1s. What do you want to do? Make it safe, fix it, whatever, to a certain degree. What do you want me to do? If they don't, and they find something, they give a dangerous situation report, is what we call it, to the client or whatever. But from a PRS perspective, which is different to 7671, there are time limits put on it, which is not normal for 7671. 7671 doesn't give a time limit on a code. It just says you should get them done as soon as possible, essentially. Whereas PRS goes up one step further. So for the way we've interpreted that private rented sector legislation, if you find a C1, then depending on the severity of it, where it is, etc. So if you find a live part and it's in a loft, yes, it's dangerous. You could die from it, but it's in a loft. How often are you going to go and get steps out and go up in there? So you still got to get it repaired within the 28 days, but the inspector could say, I'm going to give you 14 days. Or we could be in the kitchen, a socket smashed off, kids running around, and there's live parts accessible, and the inspector might say, oh man, that's dangerous. Someone could get a shot now. Right, bring the client up. Right, this is the problem. I can do whatever, but in time scales and stuff like that, I've got to get off. I'm going to give you a week to sort this out, 7 days from this inspection. I'm going to give you 5 days or 4 days, but you must understand that children can come and touch it after I leave, and you're liable in any case. So it's quite important for inspectors to understand the difference between 7671 standard EICR and those that have been written and used in the private rented sector. And the C2, it means there's a potential for danger. So that means that essentially the danger's not there straight away. If I'm going to touch something, I'm probably going to be okay. But if another fault was to occur, I might not have adequate protection. I might not have adequate shock protection. So I could then be in danger, something could catch fire, I could die, whatever. So that's a C2. It's still incredibly dangerous, but it just gives us a different sort of hierarchy of things that have gone wrong. And the way that we interpret that from the new legislation is that would be that 28-day period. So if you find a C2, then the client's got 28 days from the date of the inspection, not when the contractor gives or the inspector gives the report. It's 28 days from the report being taken. You're a C2, you've got 28 days to put it right. You've also got to tell the tenant that you put it right and various other requirements that the landlord's got to comply with. An FI is further investigation. So an electrician might find something, or inspector might find something and we're not quite sure. Again, 28 days to investigate it. It may be nothing, or it might be something else. Again, 28 days from then. So you can see how it's going. C3 is what we call an improvement is recommended, which is fine for standard installation. It means it's satisfactory. So if you've got a PRS, EICR with 15, 20, 30, 40, however many C3s, provided then that's going to dress up as a satisfactory report. But I must stress, with a it just means improvement is recommended. Now, because you are, or clients rent out a property, it might be that the client, even though it says an improvement is recommended and it's a C3 and it's satisfactory, because of the business they're in, and that business is renting a property, whether you like it or not, if you're renting a property or in business, you may have a duty of care to take a look at that improvement that's been recommended and think, well, for the safety of my tenant, I may wish to upgrade the installation. But there's no requirement from a 7671 perspective. I've waffled off quite a bit now, so I'll let someone else talk.
Well, I think it's really important as well to realise that if a system, the better electricians in the market who are helpful, shall we say, remember you're producing a periodic, or you're producing an EICR for somebody who doesn't know anything about electric, doesn't know anything about writing on an EICR in the codes that your DC to AC converter for the solar PV system is not electrically separated and therefore will saturate the RCD should there be a fault. Handing that to a landlord who doesn't know anything about electrics is going to look at you as if you've kind of set their house on fire. They're not going to understand that one bit. So if you're going to do a report and it fails, try and convert. A good engineer or a good electrician will try and convert the technical speak into very common, this is exactly what you need to do, Mr. Landlord. Make it easy to understand. There's too many electricians out there that just assume everybody knows what they're talking about. And the better ones that I've seen, we get thousands of EICRs through my software every week, and we have access to all of that information. And some of the things we see written in the observations is incredible. It's ridiculous. I struggle to understand it sometimes. And I guess that's what I'd say. Just make sure it's clear. Make sure that what you write in there is clear. So that follow-on work isn't hindered. That 28 days isn't hindered with information.
What we tried to do at NAPIT is we've written a publication. I have a little plug of it here, Ben, but this one here is I don't know if you can see that, but it's guidance for the landlord and the inspector. And myself and Richie put that together. Richard was the principal author in there and covered the legislation, and I covered the inspection items. We tried to explain to a landlord what those inspection items meant in sort of plain English. So it's sort of a helpful document for contractors to get the grips with the legislation and for landlords to get the grips with the coding. So that's available, and I'm sure you guys can ping out a link or something on that, somewhere, but you might find that useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for landlords, they're more than likely going to have a little folder somewhere with the tenancy agreements and things like that. So to have a document to make things a bit more understandable for them and to make their investment, so to speak, safer, then it's a no-brainer, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it does state that if you have an EICR carried out in accordance with that PRS legislation, that you keep a copy of the report for when the next inspector goes in, so that they can see a history forming. So it is actually a requirement on the client, the landlord, that they keep a copy of that for the next inspector. So they do have to keep something safe somewhere. It can be electronically these days. Most inspectors are going to email their reports out. You don't often see paper reports these days. They generally get emailed anyway.
Yeah. I see there's quite a lot of, I mean, we spoke about the codes and what they actually entail, but I see a lot of controversy about what the codes can be deciphered as. So a lot of people might have a different opinion on what would constitute as a C1 or a C2 or
so I've made some notes on this particular question. So I'll just read my notes out because it's I reckon that this is a nail on the head moment. I'm hoping the guys, I'm not sure whether or not the guys will agree, but I'll read through it anyway. I've put that the controversy comes from the different levels of competence in electricians across the whole country. In theory, if you call yourself an electrician, you should understand the implications of issues found during any inspection on any installation. You should have that knowledge of electrical safety risk dependent on the electrical installation. It becomes difficult when you select someone who calls himself an electrician but who's never worked independently or on that specific type of system. The electrical industry, unfortunately, whether people like it or not, is now subdivided into many areas. And until the industry accepts that, we're always going to have different opinions. You have electricians who always work in McDonald's franchises doing maintenance in McDonald's. And when that dries up and McDonald's goes into lockdown and shuts, they think, I still need to make some money. So what I'll do is I'll start testing in private rented properties. They're then going to go from machines and cookery machinery into a domestic property. And they're going to have things in that domestic property like an S-plan or a Y-plan heating system or a vented system or a warm air unit or solar PV or solar thermal. They're not going to understand the wiring schematics of that. They're going to find that difficult, and therefore they're going to code things completely in the wrong direction. And that's probably my view. Is there's too many different levels of competence of electricians in our country at the moment.
The biggest.
Well, that's one. But you've also got it's more. So we put a book out code breaker, and you see lots of people say, "Oh, we put that code in there." That's not that code. But we've been to great lengths on various seminars and webinars, and said, "Well, we have to put a line in the sand and say, we've written this book of codes, but that's for a particular type of installation at a particular level with an ordinary person present, and but that doesn't, all installations are different. So you can see one observation, and in a particular environment, that would be a C2, or in another environment, it could be a C3. It just depends on the environment and who's got access to it, who's going to use it, what's the risk from it, have you assessed it for risk, what sort of state's it in, does anybody get access to this room, is it a big issue? No, so different codes can mean different things to different people. Different people have got different perceptions. So some people are quite steadfast, right? If it's not right, then therefore it's a C1. Why is it a C1? Well, because it's not right. Well, why is it not right? It's not potentially dangerous. It's no, I can't touch it. I can pick it up. I'm not getting a shot. It can't be a C1. It's not immediately dangerous. And some people will give things a C2 if they don't meet the requirements of the latest version of 7671. Again, that's not what that particular document states. So you're always going to get a variation of what people see as different coded items, because different people see them from different perceptions from their different industries, the way they were trained and the way that they generally see things. And you'll also see a variation based on different types of installation. So certain types of installation tend to be a little bit less structured than others. That's a nice way of putting it. And some tend to be in a lot better state than others, depending on the industry that you're in. So you're always going to see some discrepancy of coding. You just can't get away from that. But rather than worry too much about, we wrote a book and it says this, and that's not the case. Well, it could be in a certain scenario, but in your particular scenario, you were the inspector on the day and you thought it was that. Don't put that, no one's stopping you. But just be aware that we can't, in the same way that it's dangerous to undercode something and be too blasé with it, it can cause just as much aggravation, upset and damage to a business or potentially someone's life if you're overzealous coding something. So you're always going to get some discrepancies.
The other thing is as well, you can have the same observation in a different set of external influences present, and there can be a different code. So an electrician can't say what's the code for a safety blank missing from a consumer unit. In domestic premises, it's probably always going to be a code 1 because there's ordinary persons in there and there's children and what have you. But if it's in a engineering workshop full of skilled engineers and it's locked away in a cupboard, the blank missing is now not as serious as the domestic example. So it's the inspectors on the day looking at the external influences, the type of property, the type of client, and using their skill and experience. We can't state that enough. We only want people doing this work that are experienced. So, you know, it's hard to get experience without doing the work, but that's just the way it is with periodic inspection. You're putting a safety report together. You've got to have the experience to be able to, you know, make the right judgments on the day.
Who's responsible to actually carry out the remedial work? Am I right in thinking it's not the tester doing it? He's more than likely going to be given the work, but it's not essentially his responsibility.
That's entirely down to the client. So the client's choice. The client goes and gets a periodic inspection and EICR carried out for their PRS legislation, blah, blah, blah. And if it's unsatisfactory, or if it's satisfactory with a ton of C3s, they may think, oh, I'll get that extra stuff done, make my tenant safer, or I've got 28 days to do that. Right, so I've got a choice now. I can ask the person that's done it, or I can get someone else. 9 times out of 10, most clients won't use the same electrician or the same inspector, unless they've got something set up previously through limitations. So if I find these C1s and C2s, what do you want to do? I need you to repair them as you go in because I need to keep the tenant safe, etc., etc. So there's all that's about running a business and various contracts and stuff like that set up. So that's difficult to do from you can't give it a hard or fast rule. Also, not all inspectors are installers. So some people are very good inspectors, but they may not want to or have a particular skill set to repair or replace something. So you can have an inspector come in and take a look at a section of a PV array, and notice that it's damaged, put it down on a report, doesn't comply with this, it's damaged, etc. They may turn around to the client and say, you need to get a specialist to get that repaired because it needs a new inverter, it needs this, it needs that, it needs the other. So, and likewise with an EV installation, electric vehicle installation, they could be damaged and the inspector may say, I don't have time for that, my business is inspection and test, you'll have to get someone else. Or the client can say, can you do this? And the inspector say, yeah, I will. It's the client's choice, to be fair. It's entirely the client's choice.
Would you say it's a specialist field as an electrician to do this kind of testing?
Very much so. I think that to carry out EICR and periodic inspection work as a general, you've got to have a lot more experience, a different skill set, and you've got to be able to almost separate yourself from the installation and see it subjectively. So yes, it's a very, very specific skill set, I think.
Do you think it's a good opportunity to sell your services whilst you're doing this testing? So if you're building a relationship with a landlord and you're doing testing and he or she might have X amount of properties, it could be a good opportunity to say, oh, I do, consumer units and whatever else you need. Do you think that could be a profitable?
I think that applies to all Sparkies, doesn't it? That applies to all Sparkies, all jobs that an electrician does. It's the aim of being in business from an electrician perspective is to market yourself in the right way. And you look at social media, for example. Social media is a fantastic place to market yourself. And yeah, maybe Twitter's not the right place anymore. It seems to be going downhill from a very kind of aggressive tone. But there are other social media platforms like Instagram seems to be the best one, where you can demonstrate how good you are, how good your work is, and you can interact and engage with people. So not necessarily selling your services as saying, look, I can upsell all the other things I can do as part of a periodic inspection, because you've still got to get through the door to get the periodic inspection job first. So the landlord already likes you because they've selected you over probably 100 other people in that area who can do that job. It's any electrician should approach any week looking for opportunities to market themselves in a positive manner, comment positively, engage with people positively, share pictures of what you do, comment on other people's pictures constructively and professionally, and that will get you. I could literally, I'm not going to, but I could reel off the common social media sparkies who I would employ every day of the week in my house because of how they conduct themselves on social media, and it's a good place to start. So,
yeah, I think no matter what profession you're in, there's a lot to be said for just having respect for what you're doing, showing some pride in what you're doing, whether that's the uniform you turn up in, the van you turn up in, how you organise your tools, down to every aspect of it. I think all the little things do add up, and that's definitely going to be recognised from your clients, especially.
yeah, absolutely.
Before we go, guys, I'd like to just ask each of you. I know we've sort of covered bits and bobs, but I'd like to ask each of you just clearly changes that you think could or should be made to EICR testing.
Well, they change continually anyway. So as 671 updates, when we start putting new stuff in there and new stuff, new equipment, new ways of working, change tests, changes the way we perceive tests. The schedules of inspections and the schedules of tests are altered over time. They altered in 18th edition. In the future, I should imagine there'll be some bits and pieces that will come across. So those documents are always used for an EICR. So the EICR generally evolves every time the regulations are updated. You'll see EICRs update and evolve, and we do take that constructive sort of criticism from our members and from the general public and from whoever when we discuss these and sort of national level meetings. So we do discuss them and we do talk about them and we do try to get things taken care of and sorted out. So in EICRs, they'll change continually. It's for time immemorial. They're always going to change. They won't stay as they are now. In the same way, we don't carry out an EICR now as we did in 1950. Because I think in 1950, I think it was a sheet of A4, and I think, if I remember right, if you go far enough back, there was a piece of paper that says, "I, Joe Bloggs, being of sound body and mind and a jolly good all-round good egg and all sorts, and being an electrician, reckon this is quite a proper install, signed date, and that's it. That's all. That's pretty much all you did to the pages and pages of inspections and schedules that we've got now. So we've gone from piece of A4 saying, "I'm a right good bloke, me. I reckon I've done you a service here. It's all okay," to what we have now.
Yeah, I mean, Richard's covered it from the point of view of how the regs evolve, but from a point of view of somebody actually using the report, and it sounds like a plug for competent person schemes, etc., but you've got to make sure the person who's applying the test has got his meter set on the correct setting. So taking the examples of RCDs over recent years, RCDs have gone whoosh and everybody's using different types to cope with the presence of DC. So you've got to ensure that when the guy's doing the test, he's noting the correct RCD, he's using the correct test on his tester if his tester does that. You've got to ensure that when he applies a test, he verifies the result. A lot of people go, right, I've got 0.41, put it down and that's it. But it's the inspector's job to look at that result and say, is it appropriate for what I'm looking at, the circuit length or whatever it is to do with? Does it match the initial design? And of course, when you do initial verification and you have a design and you follow all that through, that's great. But when you get to do an EICR, the design may not be available. So then you're looking at it from a sort of engineering point of view. Are these readings about right for the length of cables I've got? Of course, you don't know the exact route of the cables. Is the equipment working? Is it safe so we're not getting too much fault drop? All them questions, and that's the bit that's not captured on the form. That's the bit that the inspector has to be responsible for, and that's what we try and do as a body, is to go out and ensure that the guys, you know, when our assessors go round and see the guys, they say, let's have a look at a, you know, EICR, okay, explain this, do that, and they go through every test to ensure that the inspector is still fit for purpose, because you could get a guy who's done his 2391 some time ago and he's not touched the test meter for 10 years. So it's only by regular audits that you're going to ensure that it's being done correctly. So I'm sorry if I've kept on a bit about that, but that's the bit that can't be captured on the paper, is the actual competence of the inspector himself.
Yes, I've got a couple of things that I can. The first one is to answer your question in terms of the changes to the EICRs. I said earlier on that with E5 Group, what we do is we do a lot of market research, and the kind of the research that we do is global. And one of the things that we've noticed, which we assume will start to take effect over the next few years, is each of the different sectors that deal with electrical inspections will start to create their own EICRs. There won't be a generic EICR like the one that's in the wiring regulations. And the one that we have in BS 7671 now, everybody's aware that is a template. That's something that you base your inspection on. It's not the written rule, it's not the law. Everything doesn't need to be captured on that. So with E5, we recently had a conference call with somebody in rail. We've already got someone in rail, we've got someone in nuclear, in water treatment around the country, industrial and large commercial. And what we identified was that the wiring regulations template was not fit for purpose in terms of some of the tests that they wanted to conduct. So we've started to see that other sectors have started to create their own EICRs, their own templates, and they're designing flexible forms where if you work in whatever sector and you want to define the tests that you need to capture from a corporate risk profile and an asset management purpose, these individuals will start to create their own template. So you'll start seeing electrical certificates that aren't the generic ones that we see today. That is coming, whether we like it or not, and people need to be kind of aware of that. That's something that's happening now right across the country. It's not advertised because these people, they don't want people to jump on the bandwagon and start creating certificate and software to try and dine out on this. That they're more interested in the data that they need to capture to manage their budgets and their life cycles and what they do for it on a day-to-day. So yeah, that's my answer to that question. Another thing that just to kind of clarify in terms of everything we've talked about from this private renting, one of the really important facts that needs to be considered from everyone who sat on the committee that defined it, from government in MHCLG, all the way through to NAPIT, NIC, Electrical Safety First, ECA, all of these brands that are in the electrical industry need to step their game up to educate people outside of not just the electricians and not attacking the landlords to try and create something that's new. We need to support other people in that, like I said earlier on. So one of the people who I think we should be supporting more is the local authorities. They didn't have a say in the fact that they've pushed for secondary legislation, and yet they are the ones that are being asked to enforce this. And because I worked quite a lot of my working life in social housing when I didn't have my own business, I worked in social housing, and I was the senior electrical board who was responsible for 57,000 properties, and I wasn't responsible for the private renting sector. But if a legislation came in that forced the hand of a local government, and it's important to remember that this isn't forcing the hand of a local government, it's secondary legislation. That means they choose whether or not to use this to enforce in their geographical area. And if they don't see any benefit and they think that the cost of a team to manage this overrules the amount of money that they will potentially get, they won't enforce it. So if you live in one of those, it's like, no, I'm not going to say that. That's too controversial. So it is like something, but we won't go into that. A local authority decides that they're not going to push into that. A local authority says, no, we are not going to create a team to enforce and monitor private renting sector standards because, one, we don't have the money because we've seen our budgets cut significantly over the last 10 years, and two, we wouldn't know how to communicate it. We don't want to take people to court. That local authority, it doesn't matter if you're a letting agent, an electrician, people are forcing the hands of landlords, saying that it is the law, and it is categorically not the law to do this. And that's really important. So the people who've created this standard, instead of going to local authorities, because I've heard of them, a lot of my friends work in local authorities, they've been in and their pitch when they're trying to sell the dream of this legislation is not it improves electrical safety standards. It's you are aware that you could make money from fining landlords because the standards aren't that good. You can get up to £30,000 per piece. Now, if you're going in to sell the dream to a local authority using a cash value, the intent of this legislation is wrong from the beginning. And I agree with what everybody said, and Paul's commented on it. If we improve the life of one person and we prevent a death, it's so worth it. But redesign or refocus your mind back to electrical safety, because that's what we're all about. We're not about making money. If we make money on the back of electrical safety, it's a product of it's a fantastic product on the back of it. But you shouldn't be going into local authorities and selling the dream based on how much money they might be able to fine landlords, because you're just going to create a barrier. You're going to create a wall.
Yeah.
That's really important.
It's doing it for the wrong reasons, essentially, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Guys, I want to thank all of you for coming on the show today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've been looking forward to having E5 and NAPIT on the show. So thanks again for coming on. I really do appreciate that.
No, thank you.
For anyone out there watching who has found this useful, have liked what they've seen, then please make sure you like, subscribe, and hit the notification button here at SGTV. Also, make sure you are checking out E5 and NAPIT, and you can keep up to date with what those guys are doing, and it'll be well worth it in the end. So, hope you've all enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time.